The wealthiest people in the world are startup founders. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, is the richest person as of this video, owning about 1/5 of the company and worth about $300 billion. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, is worth about $200 billion. Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page, and Sergey Brin are all worth more than $100 billion apiece. In fact, 6 of the 7 richest people in the world are startup founders. But how much do most startup founders actually make? I think you'll be surprised by the answer. Startup founders are in kind of an awkward position when it comes to their pay. Early on, founders have control over how much they pay themselves, but of course the company has limited runway, so founders also don't want to increase the burn of their startup too much. Because it's a difficult balance, I get asked commonly by founders how much they should pay themselves. And I think there's a lot of people out there who are probably just curious as well. So here's the real data collected from a study from Pilot of almost 200 founders spanning multiple cities. A startup founder makes money in 2 ways, the first being salary and the second being equity. Of course, the upside is all in the equity for what the company could be worth in the future if it becomes the next Tesla, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's first look at the average salary of a startup founder. Now this varies a lot depending on a number of factors. First, how much capital has a company raised? Obviously, the more money on the balance sheet, the longer runway a company has, and the more founders can afford to pay themselves. The founders often also take their own personal situation into account. For example, being a sole breadwinner and having to support a family, or on the other end of the spectrum, being young and able to live off of ramen noodles out of a garage. Geography also matters, as you might guess, as founders in more expensive cities pay themselves more. And lastly, seniority also matters. Serial rockstar founders and senior executives can often raise bigger rounds and also frankly just have a bit more social capital to justify paying themselves more. So let's just cut to the punchline now. The answer is the average startup founder that's raised a seed round between 1 to 5 million takes home a little bit less than $100,000 a year. Once a company gets to Series A level and has raised 10 million, the average founder salary is about 150 grand a year. And once a company gets to the growth stage and has raised 20 million or more, the average founder salary grows to about 200 grand a year. But it's actually interesting to break this down by city as well. It's probably no surprise that the average salary in the major tech hubs is higher. In Texas, for example, the average founder salary of a seed company is $70K, whereas it's about $95K in LA and Boston, about $110K in New York, and $130K in San Francisco. So the Bay, which continues to be the tech hub of the world, is still the highest in terms of salary. But what's interesting is if you dig one layer deeper, the distribution of pay is very different. In Boston, regardless of whether founders have raised money, they seem to be paying themselves a salary. Whereas in the Bay, founders who haven't raised money yet typically don't pay themselves at all. So it's more of a bimodal distribution where founders bootstrap and then only pay themselves after they've raised a round. Okay, with all that said, we all know the true monetary value of being a founder is in the enormous upside from owning a big equity share of the next Apple. We've all heard the legends. Instagram sold for $1 billion just weeks after raising their first venture money. WhatsApp sold for $19 billion, Slack for almost $30 billion, and so on. But what do most founders actually sell their startups for? It turns out the FTC required every big tech company to provide data on every acquisition they made in the last decade, over 1 million. Of those, the vast majority were very small companies. 40% were sold for less than $10 million and 80% for less than $50 million. And most had less than 10 people. Is that more or less than you would have thought? Let me know in the comments. You have to remember, if you raise $5 million in venture capital and sold your company for $5 million, then all that money is going back to the investors first, and you wouldn't see a penny of it. But if you didn't raise venture capital and sold for $5 million, that could be life-changing money. So it's important to remember that the value of founder equity depends on how much they sell the business for and how much of the business they own. But you still have to put this data in context. Remember, this data is only for the 400 companies that sold to big company tech. Over the last decade, roughly 40,000 companies raised seed funding. So only 1% of them successfully sold to who you'd assume are the most acquisition-hungry companies out there. So it's fair to say that for the vast majority of venture-backed startups, their equity actually ends up not being worth much at all. But what about the rare founders who don't sell their business at all, but instead make it all the way to the promised land of the IPO? The average company value at IPO is about $1.5 billion. But of course, the founder doesn't own the entire company at that point. The case of Elon Musk owning 23% of Tesla is actually fairly high. The average for a CEO founder is about 15% of a company pre-IPO, and about 23% ownership for the entire founding group. Typically, it's the case that the CEO founder takes a lion's share of the founding equity, which makes sense, and they also tend to get equity grants, which maintain their ownership at a higher level than others too. The ownership numbers obviously differ a lot depending on how much dilution a company's taken before IPO and how many founders have to split the founder equity position. I often get comments from people that founders own a lot less of the business at IPO than they expect. But what you have to understand is every time you fundraise, you're generally taking 10 to 20% dilution and possibly another 5 to 10% dilution on top of that for the options pool. When you multiply that across pre-seed, seed, series A, B, C, and D, and so forth, it adds up. But in any case, 15% of the next Tesla or Apple is still an unbelievable amount of wealth. When you multiply that 15% by the average market cap of a company at IPO, that's roughly 225 million. Not bad, but some companies are worth 1,000 times more than that. Here's a representation of just how much money Elon Musk has, visualized in rice. Whether you think this ridiculous amount of wealth is right or not, the best founders I know aren't motivated by money, but by making a huge positive impact on the world, like electrifying our economy or sending humans to space. If you want to leave a positive impact on this channel, please leave a like or a comment, and I'll catch you next week.